key to life.
Hello, this is Sekou Burmese, your host of The Lit Review, a podcast brought to you by the Academy of Management Journal. In this podcast, we dive into the insights of recent research published in the Academy of Management Journal, and we interview authors and corporate leaders to discuss the inspiration for research ideas and how insights from this research apply to current pressing issues in organizations and markets. We have a fantastic guest this episode, Laura Huang, Professor of Management and Organizational Dynamics, Distinguished Professor, and Faculty Director of the Women's Entrepreneurship Initiative at Northeastern University. Laura's research focuses on quantifying the unquantifiable, where she examines the role of intuition and signaling in behavioral interactions and economic decisions. In our conversation today, we talk about gender differences and how this can lead to gender inequities. In a recent paper in AMJ, Laura and her co-authors investigate this question in an important entrepreneurial setting, the pitch meeting. They investigate how gender differences in communication impact investor perceptions of the venture. We also speak more broadly about her research regarding the factors connected to inequality in organizations and markets. And then Laura shares some of her personal views about the role of academic research in trying to develop solutions for these inequities. Laura also shares some great insights from her recent book about how everyone can turn adversity into an edge. I hope that you enjoy this episode of The Lit Review and my discussion with Laura Huang. Hi, Laura, and welcome to The Lit Review. How are you doing today?
Hey, Sekou. So nice to see you. And I love the name of the podcast, Lit Review.
Yes, it is a double entendre that I'd like to say is clever, but really it's just the first thing that popped into my mind when Mark asked me, what should we name it? It's like, well, a lit review is important, and I want this podcast to be lit, which means
I
good.
know.
What the kids say these days.
I like that. Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't even get but this is lit. I love that. Very nice.
All right. So we are here today to talk a little bit about some of your research. So part of what we do in this podcast is we look at a recently published paper in AMJ, and then we dive in. We invite the author, one of the authors, to come in and talk about it, but also kind of generalize. And so I want to start with the anchor paper. So the paper that we're here to discuss is one that was recently published at AMJ, entitled Sizing Up Entrepreneurial Potential, Gender Differences in Communication and Investor Perceptions of Long-Term Growth and Scalability. It's a lot of words. What the paper does really well through multiple studies is talk about how the differences in communication across gender impacts investor perceptions. And so within entrepreneurship, obviously, pitches happen quite often, and entrepreneurs are having to communicate, and just the ways that men versus women communicate has an impact potentially with investors. And so before we get into the nuts and bolts, I want to ask you a kind of general question. What motivated you to get into this topic? Why did this become a topic that you wanted to study and eventually publish in?
Yeah, that's a good question because, a lot of times, different papers have different origins. And I think that, sometimes you write papers because there's some question mark that you've had that you've observed in the world, and then you start to investigate that question. And other papers sort of come out just almost like serendipitously that you've been studying something else. Mm-hmm. And then, a topic kind of arises. And this paper was that second bucket where I had been studying entrepreneurs, and I had been studying investors. I had been studying how investors make decisions about entrepreneurs and which ones they want to invest in, provide resources to. And a lot of my earliest work was on gut feel and some of the implicit factors that investors use. And as I started doing that research, the sort of serendipitous part, or the part that started coming out, was that when investors use their gut feel, that there are all sorts of things embedded in this. Sometimes it's explicit things, sometimes it's implicit things. More often, it's implicit and subconscious things because of that gut feel nature to it. Yeah. And biases and hunches and things can be almost hidden or built into their gut feel. One of those biases being gender bias. But there are lots of different biases that are out there, including, race, ethnicity, class, religion, sexual orientation, education, accent, lots of different things. And so this paper was specifically about gender differences and gender disparities. And it's one of the papers that came out of my research on gut feel and how gender disparities kind of sometimes come out of this acquisition, this entrepreneurial acquisition process.
Yeah. Serendipity in research. I love that. I would like to say I've experienced that in my life. I think for me, I've always kind of chalked it up to me search. Just I end up the things that occur to me are things that I've personally thought about or experienced, but serendipity when it can happen is really great. So let's dive into the kind of the paper. What I guess is the way, and I'm sure you've been asked about this paper several times. It's a very interesting topic. It's very relevant. What are kind of your key takeaways that you want people to walk away from after reading this paper or reading the abstract or reading the summary of this paper? Yeah,
I think that there's some pretty, there's some takeaways that are more of the ones that are readily apparent that you notice right away. And then there are some that are either, much more implicit themselves, like the takeaways themselves are implicit. And I kind of like those implicit takeaways.
Yeah.
So let me start there before I get to some of the more obvious ones. But the sort of implicit takeaway that I really love from this paper is that we mentally represent some of the perceptions that we have based on other things. So meaning that what one thing could signify something else, and we don't even know that these two things signify the same thing. To put it much more concretely here, the fact that someone speaks abstractly gives people certain cues or signals that person is a broader thinker, or that they grow things bigger, or that they can build things much more successfully, just from like subtly being more abstract, right? And so I'm trying to think of an example of like other significant, there's this thing that in Korean culture and a lot of Asian cultures that when a child turns 1, you put objects in front of them, right? So you might put like a pen in front of them. Okay. You might put like a paintbrush in front of them. You might put a dollar bill in front of them. You put different objects and you sit the baby in front of all of these objects and then they'll grab one of them, and whichever one they grab first is what the sort of tradition says they're going to be when they grow up.
This is a signal of what they implicitly are drawn to.
Yes. So like if they pick up the pen first, it's like, oh, they're going to be a writer and they're going to be really thoughtful and introspective. If they pick up a paintbrush, right, they're going to be really artistic and abstract. If they pick up the dollar bill, they're going to be really practical. And, and so that's sort of the, like an example of, there's like subtle things. We draw connections between things. And in this paper, investors draw connections based on whether someone communicates more concretely or abstractly, or concrete representations or more abstract representations.
All right. So for those of us who are not construal theory heads, for my non-construal theory heads out there, the abstract, concrete, could you give an example of what that means, particularly with pitches, right? I have a lot of students, friends who are putting together their pitches. And I don't know if this is ever something that I've been asked specifically, like, am I being too abstract or specific, or maybe it's something they struggle with. So what are some examples of this language?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of construal theory, like construal theory is a much broader sort of umbrella that talks about how people mentally represent information using more abstract or concrete kind of cognitive representation. So this can be anything from like temporal, like is it more distance in terms of time? right?
Okay.
Is it something that's occurring far in the future versus something more recent? It can be actual physical. Are you standing closer to somebody? Or are you standing further away from someone? There's all sorts of different ways that we think about proximal, right, versus far, right? So this sort of distance kind of thing. Like, is it a smaller audience? Is it a larger audience? And so this sort of concreteness and abstractness is how we conceptualize it. Is one of the ways that my co-authors and I sort of looked at this. And by the way, shout out to my co-authors on this paper, Priyanka Joshi, Cheryl Waxlack, and Andy Wu. And so what we really wanted to do was take our understanding of construal theory and this distance, this use of constraint versus abstract speech, to try and understand the perceptions and attributions that investors are making about entrepreneurs.
All right. So I guess the $1 million question is, what do investors like more, the abstract or the concrete?
Yeah. So, I mean, as with most of our papers, there's like the main finding, and then there's like the moderators and the mediators and all that sort of stuff. The main finding here is that when people speak more abstractly, we're more likely to perceive that they are building a scalable, large business that has long-term growth. And of course, investors want to be investing in companies that have long-term growth and scalability. And so there's that sort of effect where that connection is drawn. But what's interesting here is that there's a very distinct gender component here, where we find that male entrepreneurs are more likely to be speaking abstractly, and female entrepreneurs are more likely to be speaking concretely. And so, of course, this is one way that we can kind of understand gender disparities that are out there.
Wow. All right. So that sounds like a pretty key finding. Definitely something, and I know one of the takeaways in the paper is around for female entrepreneurs to be aware of this, right? To be aware of this bias, this implicit bias, right, that investors might have. And so, tailoring your pitch in that way. Any other kind of things that you took away, even things that maybe didn't make it to the paper, but things that interested you about this before we kind of broaden the lens a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that I find really interesting that, we wanted to make sure that we highlighted in the discussion section that we want to continue highlighting is that we're not saying that women should be forced to speak a certain way, right? We're not saying that we're not telling women that they should behave in a certain way or that there is an ideal or a preferred way of speaking. It's really about embracing all different parts, because there are all of these mediators and moderators and things that are happening. But the paper was really about understanding this dimension and understanding that there are disparities in terms of who gets the investments. And the more we can understand these factors, the more that we can continue to do research that speaks to disparities and inequalities that exist. So that's something that I always want to be really clear about, because sometimes people read this paper and they're like, oh, well, the solution is to have women speak more abstractly, right? And that's not what we're suggesting at all. This is not sort of we're not trying to strategically manage impressions here. We're really trying to understand all of the multifaceted dimensions that exist.
So that's great. This is a perfect segue, because one of the things that I find really interesting, and, as academics, particularly academics in business schools, where we're an applied area. And so a lot of the things we study are to impact practice. And so in something as important and, potentially controversial as gender inequality, gender inequity, what do you see as is the role of academics, of research like this, right? And I say that with this, in the back of my mind, which is there's this idea of understanding the gap, like why is there a gap in certain things? And then there's research that says, well, how can we close it, right?
Yeah.
And so part of what you said that I loved is we're doing, one, and we're not saying that this is the other, right? But there are ways to interpret any kind of research one way as either explaining something or as a solution. And so I was just curious for you, in tackling this and you doing this in some other work as well, what do you think is the role of research, particularly around finding out and understanding the gap versus being a solution to the gap?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times we need to be able to bridge the two where we're being really open to not just the research and the methods, but also to the solutions and the sort of avenues for future research, if you want to call it that. I know that sometimes like that the discussion section and the like avenues for future research is almost like tacked on. And to be honest, that used to be my least favorite section to write, is the discussion section and like avenues for future research. And I don't know if it speaks to like my age or something, but now it's become my favorite section to write because it allows us to do exactly what you're saying, is like take what we've learned from research and start thinking about, what are the practical implications? What are the steps that we can be taking in a way where we can brainstorm, we can be hypothesizing, we can be setting up things for the future. So I think the role of research is to really outline and is to like identify a problem that exists, provide a perspective on how our research addresses that or answers it in some way, but also be opening the sort of work up to new questions and new solutions that we'll continue to investigate. So that's really the purpose of, I think, research and academia in general, is to like continue building on each other's knowledge. And I think that the more we can continue doing that and remembering that an individual paper doesn't have to be answering, it's not like the holy grail of a topic. It's like, it's really just adding to that conversation. And I think about that sometimes as like, it is like a conversation. It's like imagine that we're all around a dinner table and we've got these different, hey, let me tell you about this paper that showed this. And somebody else is like, let me tell you about a paper that showed this. And then like together we start to put this together and come up with these like very practical ways that we can be impacting entrepreneurship, impacting organizations, impacting any sort of context that we're looking at.
Yeah, I love that that take on it about the conversation, because that's valid. I mean, it also assumes that people are listening and talking to one another and not just yelling at one another on certain topics. And this is a topic I teach. A class that kind of gets at HR kind of pieces, and invariably we'll get to some inequity piece, and people, feel emotions, right? And I think that's valuable. And so part of what we can do as academics is say, well, here's what we know empirically, here's what we've seen, and then here are some solutions. And so understanding the communication patterns and how that impacts things within the entrepreneurial ecosystem. I mean, you can imagine that you talk to a group of female entrepreneurs, they're going to be interested in what you found. Now, what they do with that information, that is, I guess, part of the larger conversation, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, that's good. So I'm going to ask a question that really leans into my own bias, which is I'm familiar with your work, as you are aware. And you wrote a book a few years ago now. What is it? A few years ago? 2 years ago?
Yeah. It's gone quick.
Time is a flat circle right now. So forgive me. Called Edge. And I couldn't help but think about, in thinking about serendipity, because that book is about turning adversity into an advantage. Do you see any links in your mind, or do you see any links between kind of ideas you had in that book in general and some of this research here that you're doing looking at gender inequities?
Yeah, I mean, totally. It was exactly what you were speaking about before, which was this actionable piece of it, right? So I had been doing this research for a really long time. And every time I would present this research, I would get the question like, oh, wow, you're identifying all of these disparities and this inequality. And what do we do about it, right? What do we do about it? How do we level the playing field? What are the solutions that we could do? And so this book was really like kind of like one big discussion section. My publisher's going to hate that I describe it as that, but it was
I think that's on the inside jacket cover. One big giant discussion section that sold a lot of books.
I know. This is going to sell tons of books. We really are all just thirsting for one huge discussion section. But what this book really was, it was that I wanted to talk about, what can we do? How do we level the playing field? How do we take this adversity and flip it to our advantage? Like, if there are all these disparities, what are the ways that we can actually put things in place for ourselves so that we can gain an edge? Okay. And, and it was about this sort of notion that we work really hard. Like, all of us work really, really hard. Well, not all of us, but
yes, enough.
But hard work alone is not always enough, right? Yeah. And I saw this with entrepreneurs. I saw this with women entrepreneurs. I saw this with, Black women who were trying to, were facing like barrier after barrier after barrier, not just women, not just based on race or ethnicity, but again, like all of this like class, religion, sexual orientation, communication patterns, all of these different ways in which people were putting in the hard work, but hard work alone was not enough. And so I sort of took all of the body of work that I had been looking at, and started realizing that there were some patterns. So I sort of did one big like qualitative study of all of my work, and I realized that there was a framework embedded in this, and that was the edge, what became the edge framework, where the book is about gaining an edge, but the E, D, G, and E actually stand for the components of this framework, where the E stands for enrich, right? Mm-hmm. We all enrich and provide value, but we don't always see that, or others don't always see that. The D stands for delight. We all have authentic ways that we can delight our counterparts, regardless of whether it's an investor, a supplier, a boss, whoever. The G stands for guide. That part of gaining an edge is, even when we enrich and delight, is guiding people to the perceptions, guiding their perceptions of who we are. And the final E stands for effort and hard work. And what I realized is that effort and hard work come last. When you know how you enrich and delight and guide, that's when your effort and hard work actually work harder for you. And instead, we often think that hard work comes first, that if you put in the hard work, it'll speak for itself. But in fact, it doesn't. And so a lot of my research, a lot of, trying to understand what I was seeing in the entrepreneurship ecosystem went into this book.
All right. So you just answered, I'm glad I asked this question, because what you're telling me is you propose the questions to understand the differences in your articles, and then you answer them in the book. And this is really smart, because then people have to buy the book to understand the questions. All right.
Well, no one's going to buy it now, because I just said it's one big discussion section.
Oh, no. They will. You know why? Because Daniel Pink, author of Drive, said about Edge, it is packed with fascinating stories and counterintuitive principles. It is a must read. It's a must read.
Daniel Pink said it was a must read. All righty. Okay.
So they've only gotten the piece. They need to get all the cool stories. That's important.
Yeah. And there are some, there's some cool stories, but there are also some embarrassing stories. As you know, we've talked about this. I didn't realize how much was going to, you're writing the book and you put in all of these stories thinking that a lot of it's going to get edited. You're going to edit all of this out. And then you read the final manuscript and you're like, oh my gosh, this story is still in there. And so it's a very, interesting, humbling experience when you realize how much of these personal stories actually end up in your book.
Yeah, I'm never writing a book for that reason.
You're going to do a podcast instead.
Yes, I'm just going to reveal all my secrets on a podcast. Yes. All right. Well, two last things I want to ask. The first is, are there any kind of unanswered questions that are noodling around in your brain right now, or things that you're hoping someone else is working on? Just questions that you want to have answered.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that a lot of times I review a lot of papers now that are on gender and disparities. And so I would say that the number one thing that I sort of am always like thirsting for is like, wow, okay, we know gender disparities exist. We know that there are again, that we know that there are differences based on gender, race, ethnicity, class, et cetera, et cetera. I would love to see this work go extend beyond just the fact that there are these disparities, like continuing to like chisel away at like, why are there these disparities? So, for example, one of my doctoral students, Beck, who is at the University of Wisconsin, and I'm on his committee, we started like he's looking at pitches and he's looking at entrepreneurs. Yep. And he was looking at sort of some of these elements, and we started exploring like this congruence piece more, right? Like where for example, someone might say something and they might be like, I'm so excited, but their face doesn't look like they're excited at all, right? And or they're writing something, and so like there's the visual, there's the voice, there's all of these different things, and so he's looking at like this really interesting type of disparity, right? Yeah. That goes beyond these kind of things, but could also include all of this intersectionality and all of these different things. But he's looking at like this congruence or this like when things don't quite fit. Sure. And like, I feel like that's so uninteresting. These are the types of unanswered questions that we can take. Like, are certain people more likely to demonstrate like, I don't know, I don't even know what to call it, but like Beck can tell you all about it. Yes. But I find that kind of interesting. And these are the types of things that I think are going to continue to push the envelope when we look at things like bias and disparities and decision making and signaling and cues. And I would also love to see people continue to investigate questions around like these subtle factors. And taking like the gut feel and really like disentangling a lot more of what's embedded in that.
Yeah. Well, I also hope that Beck has much success, because that sounds interesting. I think about how many times, sitting in meetings, meeting with people, what they call these first impressions are a lot of what you're talking about, right? These gut feel. And that's what I've loved about your research, is it has shown me that oftentimes, preferences that I've had have been based on things that now I can actually put a finger on. It's like, oh, well, the reason I just tend to prefer this person versus that person is because they do this or that, or they speak this way or that way. And in this paper in particular, I was thinking about the fact that as an engineer or recovering engineer, I hate abstract. I always want concrete. And so I'd be the opposite, but I'm not the norm. And I'm also not a rich VC. So there you go.
Yeah. And I should say, I want to give Beck the full shout out, because now everyone's like, who's this Beck guy? His name is Beksod Koshimov. That's his full name. He goes by Beck, but Beksod Koshimov is his full name. So look up his work. He's doing some great work. And while I'm doing shout outs, I don't want to ignore my other doctoral student, Natalia Langbird Wright, who is also amazing. So those are my two doctoral students right now.
Well, that's good. I was about to say, is there anything you want to plug? Any other students? Anybody doing great work that you want to talk about? Or, and I have a last question after that, but anything else? Where can we hear about the latest and greatest that you have to offer?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's so much that I want to plug. I think there's a lot of great research that people are doing that are continuing to really push things. And I really applaud people who are taking chances on research. I know it's sometimes really hard to do that, but I find the most interesting papers, the ones that I'm like, oh, I wish I had written this, are ones that are like really. They just ask interesting questions that take chances, mentioning some, like I love Bess Rouse's work. I think she does really interesting work. I love Crystal Farr, Dan Filer, Jenny Carson Marr, all of their work. Who else? Like, I feel like I need to name all of these.
No, anybody you've left out, they're going to feel.
I know. We'll Andy Wu, co-author of mine. He's doing awesome work. Yeah. David Clough. Okay, who else?
I'm cutting you off. I feel like I'm
at the Oscars now, and I need to like the
music is
playing, and I'm trying to just name all of these people now. And then what was your other question? Sorry.
My last one is something that you are reading for fun right now.
Something that I'm reading for fun. Okay, I love reading fiction. So
Yes.
I even though I write nonfiction and we're all sort of in this nonfiction world, I love reading fiction. I've got a bunch of books right now. I read a lot.
A nice humble brag. Oh, I just read so much.
No, I
Yeah.
no, either that or people are like, oh wow, she's super boring. Like her hobbies are limited to like reading. But no, I love to read. So I have, gosh, what are books? I don't want to tell you what I'm reading right now because it's actually not that great of a book, but I want to give some book suggestions.
Only
Let's
one.
see.
Only
Just
one.
one?
Yep. And it can't be from the same publisher as your book.
I know. Okay,
Tell me the terrible book you're reading right now. We want to hear about it.
No, because I feel like I'm an author. I know how horrible it is when somebody says like negative things about your book. And there's plenty of.
Don't tell us the bad book. Tell us the other book that you're reading that's fun. That's also the same book.
Okay, so I love reading memoirs. I know that's so When Breath Becomes Air is one of my favorite books.
Got it. All right.
You'll cry a lot, but I want to give a good fiction book. Let's see. I love Hal Borland has some really great books. He's not an author that's super well known, but I really love his books. Elizabeth Strout is an author that I like a lot. Okay, so that's a couple there. So
all right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Laura, for giving us your time today. And thank you, audience members, for devoting your time for this podcast. We'll be back next month. And until then, take care. All right, that's it for the Lit Review. I appreciate Laura for her time, and I appreciate you all for listening. If you like this episode, please subscribe to the Lit Review podcast. You can find us by searching The Lit Review and AMJ podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and other podcast platforms, as well as on the AMJ homepage. You can also follow us on Twitter. We have a weekly Twitter Spaces show called AMJ Radio Live, hosted by AOM Connect on Twitter Spaces. I'll be joining the show once a month to provide a behind-the-scenes look at the podcast and answer any listening questions. Thanks to the Academy of Management for their support for this podcast. Special thanks to my producer, Holly Fearing, for all of her work behind the scenes. Our theme music is produced by Key to Life. This is Sekou Burmese. See you next time. Take care and be good.